Not all surnames disappeared with the Nazi defeat. For some it was a curse, for others an advantage. Today, decades after the collapse of the Third Reich, the grandchildren of its most bloodthirsty leaders still live on. And each has had to decide what to do with the history that carries their blood. Some cut ties, changed their names, or chose internal exile. Others spoke out, investigated, and denounced. A few even kept fortunes built on slave labor. How do the heirs of the Third Reich live today? Is it possible to live in peace with a family name marked by crime? And what remains of Nazism in their daily lives? Reiner Hss, the necessary betrayal. The surname Hss belongs to that category of names that open wounds more than doors. Reiner carried it for years like an invisible backpack, burdened with a story that no one in his family had ever mentioned until it was no longer possible to live in ignorance. Reiner Hss's story didn't begin at Auschwitz, but it always revolved around that place. In the 1970s Germany, when silence still reigned over the Nazi past, the Hss family lived amidst school routines and after-dinner conversations where the words war and grandfather floated like meaningless abstractions. Rudolf Hss wasn't the commandant of the largest extermination camp in history. He was simply a blurred figure, devoid of depth or context. Everything changed during a school trip to the Dachau concentration camp. 15-year-old Reiner stopped in front of an information board where the photograph and name of Rudolf Hss were clearly visible. He recognized him immediately. That night at home, the question came up during dinner. His father evaded the answer. His mother sent him to bed. But his aunt, perhaps tired of the weight of silence, confirmed it. Yes, your grandfather was the commandant of Auschwitz. That sentence split his life in two. What began as a doubt turned into an obsession. Reiner needed to know who Rudolf Hss really was. He visited libraries, read books banned at home, and sought out testimonies. What he found was far worse than he had imagined, an extermination machine run with bureaucratic efficiency and a fanatical devotion to Nazism. Rudolf Hss didn't just command Auschwitz. He lived inside the complex, in an elegant 10-room residence with his family, including Reiner's father. The house, with its garden and imprisoned servants, was just a few meters from the gas chambers. While the children played, thousands of people were gassed daily on the other side of the wall. That duplicity left a deep mark on Reiner. His father had grown up in an artificial paradise built on the site of hell, and decades later he still defended the criminal. The Jews asked for it, he would say at family gatherings. Auschwitz was a labor camp, not an extermination camp. Reiner didn't share those ideas. He hated them viscerally. The rupture was absolute. He left home, cut off all contact with his family, and became the black sheep of the Hss clan. At the boarding school where he sought refuge, the gardener, a Holocaust survivor, identified him and physically confronted him. You're not responsible, he told him later, but your name bleeds. Without family support, Reiner searched for meaning in the archives. He began methodically researching, reading everything available about his grandfather. Under his leadership, Auschwitz perfected the use of Zyklon B, installed high-capacity crematoria, and became the epicenter of the final solution. Hss personally oversaw the expansion of the Birkenau complex and participated in the Wannsee Conference that sealed the fate of millions of European Jews. One of the most intense moments of his life was his visit to Auschwitz. Returning to the place where his grandfather had exercised his power, not as a tourist, but as a direct descendant of the executioner, was an act of radical confrontation. There, he met a group of Israeli students. A young woman handed him a small seashell painted with a blue Star of David. "Take it with you," she told him. "This memory is yours too." Since then, Reiner has worn it around his neck as a symbol of an unexpected alliance with the victims. Reiner understood that silence was not an option. He began speaking publicly. He gave interviews, participated in documentaries, and accompanied survivors on memorial visits. On one occasion, he offered his grandfather's personal belongings for an exhibition. He was harshly criticized, but he did not give up his mission. The personal cost has been high. His family considers him a traitor. He has received threats from neo-Nazi groups and has lived with the emotional burden of being constantly questioned about his last name. On one occasion, he tried to contact a former Polish prisoner who had been his grandfather's personal barber. He wanted to ask him if he remembered any humane gestures from Rudolf Hss. The man replied, "No." He was a murderer, even when he smiled. In 2015, Reiner Hss was mistakenly included on a list of neo-Nazi sympathizers after his name was linked to far-right forums that used his identity without authorization. Alerted by the resurgence of denialist groups, German authorities began monitoring certain social media profiles, and the Hss surname was again listed as a symbolic risk. Reiner publicly denounced the use of his surname by neo-Nazi groups to legitimize hate speech, even forging purported letters from the commander's grandson. At an event in Leipzig, he faced physical threats from attendees who accused him of being a traitor to Aryan blood. For months, he lived with unofficial police protection while continuing to participate in educational events. The irony of being attacked by those who revered his grandfather revealed how uncomfortable his struggle was, not only for his family, but also for the ideological heirs of the Third Reich. Reiner currently lives in Germany. In his lectures, he speaks about the resurgence of xenophobia, persistent anti-Semitism, and the danger of hate speech. He mentions far-right parties and denialist movements and reminds us that everything begins with words. Bettina Gring, breaking the lineage from the body. In some families, the surname is a coat of arms, in others, a tombstone. Bettina Gring was born with one of the most burdensome surnames in modern German history. Hermann Göring, her great-uncle, was one of the founders of the Third Reich, supreme commander of the Luftwaffe, head of the Gestapo in its early days and architect of Nazi racial policies. Bettina didn't inherit his uniform, but she did inherit his shadow. Growing up in Germany during the years following World War II, she realized from a young age that her surname generated uncomfortable reactions. Stares, silences, distance. No one could explain it to her, but the legacy was there, inescapable. She was about 10 years old when she understood the true weight of her last name in a history class. Her great-uncle's name appeared in textbooks associated with bombings, deportations, and war crimes. She recognized it immediately, but kept quiet. She kept it to herself like an internal burn. Over the years, the gap between what she knew and what she felt widened. At home, her grandmother, who had been very close to Hermann Göring during the regime, denied the crimes of Nazism. When Bettina tried to talk about the Holocaust after watching a documentary about Auschwitz, the reaction was brutal. Her grandmother claimed it was all Jewish propaganda, a fabrication of the victors. That night, Bettina knew she had to escape. At 13, he left home. It was his first act of rupture, the most urgent. He fled without a clear direction, beginning a nomadic life. He lived in communes, visited spiritual centers, and explored the hippie movement and the countercultural circles of the 1970s and 1980s. He sought to reinvent himself far from Germany, far from the Göring name. She participated in gatherings where children of Nazi victims met with children of executioners. At one such gathering, an elderly Jewish man, a concentration camp survivor, showed her his forearm, bearing a tattooed number. "You and I should never have met in this life," he said. But then, surprisingly, he hugged her. At 30, Bettina made a radical decision. She voluntarily underwent sterilization. It wasn't a medical choice, but a symbolic one. She didn't want children. She didn't want the Göring name, its genetic makeup, or its history to be carried on through her body. For her, the act of sterilization was a biological and spiritual break. It was a break with the past, through the body. "I felt like my lineage had to end with me. I was afraid there was something in my blood, something that could repeat itself." Her brother, who shared that sentiment, made the same decision. He expressed it with a phrase Bettina never forgot: "I've cut the line." It wasn't teenage drama. It was an adult, thoughtful decision to close a historical cycle from the depths of her heart. Bettina eventually settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico. There she found the peace she hadn't found in her home country. Between deserts, indigenous rituals, spiritual communities, and Jewish neighbors, she built a new life. She works as an alternative therapist, away from the public eye. In the documentary Hitler's Children, she appears as a vulnerable and honest figure. She doesn't try to redeem herself or justify herself. In a striking scene, she marches among children of Holocaust survivors, participating in a symbolic exercise. As she walks, others insult her, confront her, and accuse her. She doesn't respond, she just cries. That scene encapsulates the conflict of entire generations born burdened by an inheritance they didn't choose. Bettina's story poses an uncomfortable question. Can one feel guilt for something they didn't do? For her, the answer is yes. Not as a judicial guilt, but as a moral burden. It's not a self-imposed punishment. It's about setting limits, about deciding that history won't repeat itself through her. In interviews, she's confessed that she sometimes wonders if her decision was too extreme, or if her life would have been different with a different last name. But she doesn't regret it. She knows that many people don't understand what it means to carry a name that represents death, cruelty, and destruction. He lives in peace, but he doesn't forget. He's not an activist. He's not involved in politics. He doesn't lead foundations. His act was personal, not public, but his silence holds a powerful resonance. Not all acts of resistance are carried out with banners. Some are carried out with a scalpel. Through it, we understand that not all descendants seek public redemption. Some simply want to make a personal break with the past. And that sometimes the body becomes the most silent yet most definitive battlefield of historical memory. Katrin Himmler, the historian who exposed her surname. Some escape the burden of their family name, others confront it with clarity and method. Katrin Himmler chose this second path. Her story is not that of a passive victim, but that of a researcher who decided to delve into the family archives, even if it meant shattering the myths that had raised her. Katrin was born in 1967, in a Germany where the name Himmler resonated as one of the pillars of the Nazi regime. Heinrich Himmler, her great-uncle, had been the head of the SS, architect of the Third Reich's repressive apparatus, responsible for the creation of the concentration camps. But at home, the narrative was different. Her grandfather, Ernst Himmler, was presented as a family man, uninvolved in crimes. Heinrich, though ever present as a shadow, was an avoided topic. This was how Katrin grew up, between walls of silence and carefully edited memories. Adolescence brought the first cracks to that story. A classmate asked him point blank if he had anything to do with Heinrich Himmler. The question hit him like a rock. He didn't know how to answer. But from that day on, his last name ceased to be just a signature and became a persistent question. It wasn't until she became pregnant years later that she felt the urgency to solve this family mystery. I didn't want my son to inherit the silence. I wanted him to know the real story, without the myths. Katrin began investigating the lives of the three Himmler brothers. Heinrich, the best known, Gebhard, the eldest, and Ernst, their grandfather. The goal was clear: to understand whether Ernst had been, as his family said, a mere bystander, or if he had also been part of the Nazi machinery. What he found shattered the family image. His grandfather had been an active member of the SS, affiliated with the Nazi Party from an early age, and a high-ranking official at German state radio where hate speech was broadcast. In a letter, he recommended the deportation of a Jewish engineer, a decision that likely condemned the man to death. In 2005, Katrin published Die Brüder Himmler, eine deutsche Familiengeschichte, The Himmler Brothers, the story of a German family, a nearly 400-page essay that dissects one of the darkest dynasties of the Third Reich. His work is not a conventional biography of Heinrich. It is an X-ray of how families functioned within Nazism, how loyalties, justifications, and passive complicity were constructed, and above all, how, after the war, these families rewrote their story to survive without taking responsibility. The book made an immediate impact. It was celebrated by scholars and Holocaust survivors. But within her own family, it was received as a betrayal. Some relatives accused her of blackening their name. Others cut off contact. Katrin continued her research. The Himmler surname, although officially repudiated, remains revered in extremist circles. Following the publication, Katrin received threats. She was warned that she was dishonoring German memory, that she was allied with the enemies of the Reich. In an interview, she was asked if she feared for her safety. She replied, "I fear oblivion more than hatred." Unlike other descendants who changed their surname, Katrin decided to keep it. "Because changing it doesn't change history. I prefer people to look me in the eye and know that Himmler can also mean something else: responsibility, memory, truth." One of her most valuable contributions is dismantling the myth of the innocent family. Many Germans, after the war, adopted a narrative that their relatives knew nothing or did not actively participate. She proved otherwise through documents, letters, and testimonies. His book reveals how the Himmlers benefited financially from the regime, how their professional, social, and personal decisions were aligned with the Nazi project, and how, after the collapse of the Third Reich, they recycled themselves into society without facing real consequences. This pattern is repeated in thousands of German families, turning their work not only into a family biography, but also into a collective mirror that invites us to rethink inherited memory. The conflict between those who decided to break with their lineage and those who silenced it was not solely personal or familial. In West Germany, between 1979 and 1985, a confidential pilot program was carried out in Bavarian schools, where the state attempted to address the Nazi legacy through the education system. 62 families whose surnames were linked to members of the SS, the Gestapo, or the NSDAP participated. The students received special psychological counseling under discreet supervision. Although the program was shut down after press leaks denouncing discriminatory practices, documents declassified in 2009 revealed an early institutional attempt to confront the intergenerational burden of the past. Unlike individual decisions like Bettina Gring's, this approach sought to intervene through educational means but ended up reproducing stigmas. Today, these archives serve as a source for studies on how the state, schools, and families attempted, and sometimes failed, to confront their Nazi legacy. Jennifer Teege, granddaughter of the executioner, daughter of silence. Jennifer Teege's identity contains a fundamental contradiction. She is Afro-German, Jewish by cultural choice, and the direct granddaughter of Amon Goeth, one of the cruelest Nazi commanders. Her story represents a unique case where blood and memory collide head-on in the body of the same person. The discovery of this origin occurred in 2008 in a public library in Hamburg. Jennifer, 38, was browsing books when she found one with a red cover. Upon opening it, she recognized her biological mother, Monica Hertwig, in its pages. The book revealed that Monica's father was Amon Goeth, commandant of the Plassau camp, the man who shot prisoners from his balcony, immortalized by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List. The revelation caused a physical and emotional collapse. For weeks, Jennifer couldn't sleep or care for her children. Her identity, carefully constructed over decades, crumbled in the face of a truth no one had told her. Jennifer had not been raised by her biological mother. Given to an orphanage at birth, she was adopted at age 7 by a German family. She knew she was of African descent. Her father was Nigerian, but she was unaware of her maternal origins. During her youth, she had lived in Israel, studied in Tel Aviv, learned Hebrew, and established deep ties with the Jewish community. No one, not even she, could have imagined that she was a descendant of the executioner of that same town. The most devastating thing was the realization that, had she lived in her grandfather's time, she would have been exterminated by the racial policies he himself implemented. This existential paradox led her to a psychiatric facility where she was diagnosed with acute depression. The recovery process included writing "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me" with journalist Nicola Selmer. The book narrates her double grief, her mother's abandonment, and the discovery of her family legacy. Unlike Reiner Hss or Katrin Himmler, Jennifer didn't have decades to come to terms with her connection to Nazism. She discovered it as an adult with an already formed identity, which made the impact even more severe. To process this truth, Jennifer traveled to Poland. She visited Plaszow, where thousands were executed under her grandfather's command. She stood in front of Goeth's house, breathed the same air, looked at the same horizon. She wasn't looking for redemption, but for understanding. She also reconstructed the story of her mother, Monica, who also lived under the weight of silence. Goeth's widow kept a photograph of him until her suicide, never denying him. Jennifer understood that the trauma had been passed on like a toxic inheritance. Her mother, the daughter of a criminal, was raised in denial. She, in turn, grew up in neglect. Jennifer's experience differs radically from that of other descendants. Her very body, her black skin, her African features, is a living contradiction of the racial ideal her grandfather championed. This paradox has been central to her process of personal reconciliation. As she herself has said, "My existence would have been impossible in the world he wanted to create." Jennifer currently lives in Germany, writes and lectures. She hasn't changed her surname, but she has transformed its personal meaning. Unlike Bettina Gring, she didn't cut ties with her lineage through sterilization. Unlike Katrin Himmler, she didn't exhaustively research family archives. Her approach has been more visceral, using her own existence as a testament to the historical defeat of the Nazi racial project. Her story was adapted into the animated short film Holy Holocaust, which depicts her friendship with an Israeli woman. The paradox of the victim and the murderer's granddaughter sharing an everyday life symbolizes for her the only possible way out, not automatic forgiveness, but shared consciousness. In 2016, the documentary about Jennifer Teege's life was rejected from 2 historical film festivals in Germany for not fitting the thematic focus of the event. Although the organizers publicly denied this, independent media outlets leaked internal emails alluding to its excessive emotional exposure, as the protagonist does not adequately represent German memory. The real reason, as revealed by a journalist from Der Freitag, was the discomfort with presenting a woman of African descent as a figure inheriting Nazism. The controversy sparked protests from cultural associations and motivated Jennifer to speak out about structural racism in German public memory. Since then, her story has become a symbol of how the discourse on Nazi heritage continues to face invisible barriers, even in official contexts. Jennifer keeps getting asked, "How did you get over it? Does it still hurt?" She replies that there's no definitive overcoming, just awareness and ongoing rebuilding. Her case represents one of the most complex forms of Nazi legacy, one that reveals itself late, when identity is already consolidated. But it also demonstrates that even the most devastating truths can be integrated into a new life narrative. As she herself states, "Blood does not condemn, but neither does it redeem. Only conscience saves." Ricardo Eichmann, The Dignity of the Non-Renegade. While some heirs of the Third Reich chose public exposure or internal exile, Ricardo Eichmann opted for a less visible but equally significant path: rejection without display, commitment without spectacle. The son of the man who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, Ricardo never sought prominence or made his surname a banner. He chose ethics without fanfare. Ricardo was born in Buenos Aires in 1955. His father, Adolf Eichmann, lived under the alias Ricardo Clement, working at an automotive company and raising his children in a seemingly normal life. Little Ricardo had no idea who his father really was, the architect of the transportation system that led millions of Jews to their deaths. When the Mossad captured Adolf Eichmann in 1960 and transported him to Israel, Ricardo was barely 5 years old. His memory of the event is hazy: a father disappearing, a mother crying, a house no longer safe. 2 years later, Eichmann was executed after a trial in Jerusalem that captured the world's attention. Upon returning to Germany with his mother, Ricardo grew up in an environment marked by a dense silence. There was no talk of trains, gas chambers, or trials, but the past hovered like a specter in every interrupted conversation. Unlike his older brothers, Klaus, Horst, and Dieter, Ricardo did not develop sympathy for his father figure. When he began to investigate on his own as a teenager, he discovered a monstrous reality. Adolf Eichmann had not been a mere bureaucrat. He was a fanatical organizer of extermination, whose court statements revealed not regret but pride in his efficiency. While his brothers publicly defended their father and some even founded neo-Nazi organizations, Ricardo chose another path. He didn't feel guilt, he felt rejection. Rather than immersing himself in recent history, he turned his gaze to the deep past. He studied archaeology, prehistory, and Egyptology in Heidelberg, specializing in ancient Near Eastern cultures. He earned his doctorate in 1984 and joined the German Archaeological Institute, where he built a respected career free from controversy. He served as director of the Department of the Orient until his retirement, leading excavations in Syria, Egypt, and Jordan. This professional choice was no coincidence. While others talked about World War II, he studied civilizations separated by millennia. Archaeological remains offered a perspective that relativized recent horrors, placing them within the long chain of human history, not as justification but as context. In 1995, Ricardo had a symbolic encounter. He met with Zvi Aharoni, the Mossad agent who had captured his father. The meeting, private and away from cameras, included no apologies or recriminations, only curiosity to meet the man who had exposed the family hoax. He later declared, I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I understand why my father was executed. He was responsible for the greatest crime in history. This statement marked a fundamental difference from his brothers, who insisted on presenting Adolf as the victim of a conspiracy. Ricardo's decision not to change his last name was perhaps his most significant gesture, not out of pride, but out of integrity. Changing my name doesn't change history. I prefer to bear it with dignity and show that a last name doesn't define who you are. Unlike Reiner Hss, who became a spokesperson for memory, or Katrin Himmler, who researched family archives, Ricardo chose to speak through his work and everyday behavior. He declined television interviews and offers to write memoirs. His few public appearances occurred in academic contexts, where he spoke not as the son of the executioner, but as a scientist. In his university classes, he never mentioned his father, but when a student recognized his last name and asked, he would honestly answer, "Yes, I am his son, and I completely reject what he did." Living with the Eichmann surname in Germany meant facing a range of reactions, from revulsion to morbid curiosity. Ricardo always responded with dignity, never seeking sympathy or allowing his background to limit his professional development. One of the reasons for his discretion was to protect his own family. Married with children, he built a home where the past wasn't a secret, but neither did it dominate the present. He taught his children the importance of individual responsibility and the impossibility of inheriting guilt. In one of his rare public appearances, he summed up his philosophy: "We don't inherit guilt, but we do inherit the consequences. And each person decides what to do with them." This stance represents a third way between public activism and denial. Ricardo didn't need dramatic gestures or grandiloquent declarations. His resistance was silent but constant. He chose archaeology as a way to connect with a past older than Nazism. He kept his surname as an affirmation that individuals are not determined by their lineage, and he rejected both the glorification and media exploitation of his family history. His approach contrasts with other descendants who have made their surname a public cause or a source of income. Ricardo demonstrates that ethics doesn't require spectators, that the break with the past can be intimate and silent, but no less profound. Where others gave lectures, he dug graves. Where others wept in chambers, he preferred ancient archives. His life is his message: you can be the child of a genocidaire and build a life of integrity and knowledge. Intact dynasties, the fortunes of the Reich. While some descendants grappled with the symbolic weight of their surnames, others inherited something more tangible: fortunes built during the Third Reich. This chapter examines how the economic power of Nazism survived military defeat, reshaping itself in the corporate landscape of modern Germany. Unlike political leaders, many businessmen who collaborated with the regime were never brought to trial. Their industrial empires passed intact to subsequent generations, along with a peculiar selective amnesia about their origins. The Quandt surname, now associated with BMW, exemplifies this continuity. Günther Quandt, the patriarch, was not simply an opportunistic entrepreneur. He was an enthusiastic collaborator who put his factories at the service of the Nazi war effort. During the war, his companies produced weapons, U-boat batteries, and ammunition, using more than 50,000 forced laborers, prisoners of war, deported Jews, and political prisoners in slave-like conditions. Deaths at his facilities never appeared on the company's financial statements. After the war, Günther Quandt was never prosecuted. He died in 1954 without facing justice. His son, Herbert Quandt, not only inherited the family empire, but also expanded it. He was the one who rescued BMW from bankruptcy in the 1960s, turning it into the giant it is today. Today, his children, Susanne Klatten and Stefan Quandt, control nearly 50% of the company and are among the richest people in Germany. The documentary The Silence of the Quandts, 2007, exposed this hidden history for the first time, revealing documents and testimonies about the family's direct collaboration with the Nazis. Public pressure forced them to fund an independent investigation, the Scholtes Report, which in over 1,000 pages confirmed the crimes and corporate complicity. However, the report did not result in significant compensation or a profound overhaul of the corporate image. The factories where slave laborers died are still operating. The fortune, accumulated during the darkest years of the 20th century, continues to generate dividends. Within this same dynasty, the case of Colin Bettina Quandt, granddaughter of Magda Goebbels, wife of the Nazi propaganda minister and a symbolic mother of the Reich, stands out. At 16, Colin discovered that his grandmother was not an abstract figure from the past, but the woman who murdered her 6 children with cyanide in Hitler's bunker. This revelation changed his life. Unlike his sisters, Colin made a radical decision. He converted to Judaism and cut ties with his family. He married a Jewish businessman descended from Holocaust survivors, drawing a line not in legal documents but in life decisions. His sisters chose a different path. Heirs to the Quandt empire, they maintained a low profile. They abandoned the Goebbels name, but not the dividends from factories where Jewish prisoners died. From Bad Homburg, they control the family holding company, managing assets in various multinationals. In rare interviews, they admit that living with that history represents a burden, but that burden hasn't prevented them from enjoying its material benefits. Another emblematic figure of this economic continuity is Friedrich Flick, one of the Third Reich's greatest industrialists. His conglomerate of steel, chemical, and arms companies not only benefited from the regime, it actively contributed to its creation. Flick donated millions to the Nazi Party and took over Jewish businesses through so-called forced Aryanizations. During the war, he used slave labor in at least 60 factories. He was one of the few tycoons tried at Nuremberg, where he received a 7-year sentence for crimes against humanity. He only served 3. Upon his release, he rebuilt his empire with astonishing speed. By the 1960s, he was once again one of the richest men in Europe. His son, Friedrich Karl Flick, inherited not only the fortune, but also the silence. In 1985, he sold his stake in Daimler-Benz for 2 billion marks, but never publicly addressed the origin of that wealth. The Flick dynasty exemplifies how economic power can survive any political defeat. The case of Porsche illustrates the same continuity. Ferdinand Porsche, the brand's founder, was not an apolitical businessman trapped in difficult circumstances. He designed the Volkswagen Beetle on Hitler's direct order, and his factories produced military vehicles for the Wehrmacht using more than 15,000 forced laborers. After the war, Ferdinand was briefly detained but never prosecuted. His son, Ferry Porsche, rebuilt the family business, maintaining close ties to former SS members. Today, the Porsche-Piech clan controls a large part of the Volkswagen Group, the world's largest automobile manufacturer, without ever making a significant statement about its origins. In German homes, few brands are as ubiquitous as Dr. Oetker. Its food products, pizzas, desserts, yeast, are present in millions of kitchens. During the Nazi era, this family business profited heavily from the war effort, used forced laborers, and collaborated with the SS. The family recently commissioned a study of its past that confirmed these facts. The response was a brief corporate statement with no concrete gestures of reparation. This pattern is repeated in dozens of German companies. Historical investigations documenting complicity with the Nazi regime, followed by minimal responses and no practical consequences. The reports end up shelved, transformed into academic exercises with no real impact on wealth distribution. There is a striking contrast between the way Germany has dealt with its political and economic past. While the crimes of Nazi leaders have been widely documented and condemned, the fortunes built on those same crimes continue to generate profits for their heirs. Monuments commemorate the victims, but trademarks have erased their connection to the executioners. David de Jong, author of Nazi Billionaires, sums up this paradox. Some German families sat down to tell their grandchildren the story of the Holocaust, others to count dividends. Corporate responsibility seems to be diluted with each generation. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Nazi industrialists can argue, not without some logic, that they committed no crimes, but they continue to benefit from a heritage built on slave labor and systematic plunder. This economic dimension of the Nazi legacy represents a less visible but equally significant chapter in German memory. While descendants like Reiner Hss and Katrin Himmler have publicly confronted the legacy of their ancestors, the great industrial dynasties have largely opted for discreet silence or symbolic gestures without material consequences. The question these untouched fortunes raise is not only ethical but practical. What does historical reparation really mean when the economic benefits of crime continue to accrue to the same people? Can a society consider itself reconciled with its past when the economic structures created during the Nazi regime continue to determine its present? In 2022, a group of German financial analysts created the first European ethical fund to exclude from its portfolios any company with historical ties to the Third Reich. Called Gerecht Invest, the fund is based on declassified reports from the Arolsen archive, lists of forced laborers, and judicial databases. More than 40 companies were identified as beneficiaries of expropriations, slave labor, or contracts with the Nazi regime. Some, such as Dr. Oetker, BMW, Siemens and Mann, were removed from the index. Despite the effort, the fund faced resistance on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, with several firms demanding that their names be removed from public records. The fund remains active and has been imitated by similar initiatives in the Netherlands and France, opening a new avenue of economic pressure on the financial heirs of the Third Reich. In this story, surnames are not just symbolic inheritance, they are trademarks, stock market shares, real estate. The economic power of the Third Reich did not end in 1945. It merely changed form, transforming from being part of a genocidal machine into respectable family businesses integrated into the global economy. Beyond the economic power of large business dynasties, there is a less discussed but equally revealing phenomenon: the silent normalization of the immediate family members of Nazi leaders, many of whom avoided public condemnation, retained material privileges, or even occupied positions of institutional power without confronting their legacy. The case of Gudrun Burwitz, Heinrich Himmler's daughter, is emblematic. A convinced militant of the Nazi ideology, she never renounced her father. For decades, she quietly headed the organization Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, which provided legal and financial support to Nazi war criminals on the run or in prison. Burwitz lived on the outskirts of Munich, with social support from nationalist circles, and never faced judicial or social consequences for her activism. Another example is Edda Göring, the only daughter of Luftwaffe commander and propaganda minister Hermann Göring. Raised as a Reich princess, she maintained her symbolic status after the war. For years, she received a state pension as the daughter of a Reich official, lived on inherited properties, and never showed remorse for her father's role. Until her death in 2018, she gave sporadic interviews in which she lamented the German defeat, but not the regime's crimes. In Austria, the descendants of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was responsible for the repression in the Netherlands, managed to quietly reintegrate into public life. Some held minor technical or political positions, protected by changing their surnames and deliberately omitting their family history. This pattern is repeated in other families of high-ranking Nazis, whose children and grandchildren, protected by community silence and a lack of media pressure, managed to rebuild their lives without ever having to confront history. Memory on the Run, the descendants who never spoke. The map of Nazi heirs reveals not only different responses to the past, but also varying degrees of visibility. For every Reiner Hss who chooses to speak out, there are dozens of descendants who have opted for silence, denial, or simply disappearance. This chapter explores this less visible territory, that of those who never spoke out, those who transformed silence into a strategy. Klaus Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann's firstborn, embodies this active denial. Born in Germany and moved to Argentina after the war, he grew up with a family narrative that portrayed his father not as a war criminal, but as a persecuted patriot. During his adolescence in Buenos Aires, he frequented German youth circles where he met Sylvia Hermann, the daughter of a Jewish Dachau survivor. This chance encounter changed history. In a conversation, Klaus began speaking proudly of his father and repeating anti-Semitic phrases. Sylvia, horrified, shared this with her father, Lothar Hermann, who alerted the Mossad. This testimony led to the identification of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. However, after his father's capture and execution, Klaus did not re-examine his views. On the contrary, he intensified his defense, blaming a Jewish conspiracy for having manipulated justice. He never acknowledged his father's guilt. He never expressed the slightest remorse. His brother Horst went even further. He founded the Argentine National Socialist Front, a neo-Nazi organization active in the 1960s and 1970s. From that platform, he claimed his father as a martyr and actively promoted Holocaust denial. He participated in hate speech, distributed anti-Semitic literature, and maintained ties to networks of former SS officers exiled in Latin America. The contrast with his younger brother Ricardo Eichmann could not be more profound. While Ricardo chose silent but firm rejection, Klaus and Horst chose to perpetuate the ideology that led their father to organize mass deportations. This divided family pattern is repeated in numerous families linked to Nazism. Siblings raised in the same environment take radically different paths. It's not genetic, it's a moral choice. Beyond the well-known cases, there is a vast grey area of silence. Dozens of high-profile families in Germany, Austria, Argentina, and Paraguay whose ties to the Nazi regime are documented, but whose descendants have chosen to remain invisible. They don't give interviews, they don't write memoirs, they don't participate in documentaries. They have changed their surnames, modified their biographies, emigrated to remote locations, or simply instructed lawyers to block any investigation into their family past. This silence is not neutral, it has historical consequences. It prevents the construction of a complete memory, leaves gaps in the narratives, dark areas in the biographies. And above all, it opens the door to distortion and revisionism. In many German families, the post-1945 narrative was not one of regret, but of myth. The grandfather who was just following orders, the uncle who didn't know what was going on, the father who tried to help some Jews. This family mythology, passed down from generation to generation, has created a parallel version of history where responsibility always lies elsewhere. Such stories are not harmless. They have shaped the perceptions of entire generations. Children raised unaware that their house was bought at a bargain price after the deportation of its Jewish owners. Teenagers unaware that the family business grew thanks to contracts with the SS. Young people unaware that their last name appears on concentration camp documents. The harm of these silences isn't just moral, it's practical. The lack of voices openly acknowledging the guilt of their ancestors has left a void exploited by denial movements. If the descendants themselves don't speak out, if family archives remain closed, if properties don't bear commemorative plaques, then denial finds fertile ground. Recent years have seen a worrying rise of far-right groups in Europe that use precisely this vacuum of testimony to question established history. Every family that remains silent, every archive that remains inaccessible, every unexplained fortune unwittingly contributes to this questioning. The reasons for this silence are diverse. Some families fear social stigmatization. Others protect economic interests linked to their surname. Many simply don't want their children to grow up burdened with a past they didn't choose. Some, a minority, remain ideologically aligned with Nazism, although they don't express it publicly. The social environment has also been decisive. For decades, German society preferred not to dwell too much on the past. In many communities, former Nazis returned to prestigious positions: doctors, teachers, civil servants, mayors. In that context, those who spoke out were considered traitors, not those who remained silent. But today, with the direct perpetrators deceased and historical documentation widely available, silence is harder to justify. What was once understandable fear has become deliberate avoidance. The ethical dilemma posed by these persistent silences isn't about inherited guilt. No one is suggesting that grandchildren should apologize for crimes they didn't commit. It's about historical responsibility, the obligation to contribute to the truth when one has privileged access to it. A family letter, a diary, a deathbed confession. These private documents may hold keys to understanding how the Nazi apparatus worked, how certain decisions were made, what happened to missing persons. Keeping them hidden doesn't protect anyone alive. It only perpetuates uncertainty for families still searching for answers about their loved ones. Some advocates of silence argue that opening old wounds only causes more pain. But the experience of descendants like Reiner Hss, Katrin Himmler, and Jennifer Teege suggests otherwise. It is precisely secrecy, omission, and white lies that generate intergenerational trauma. The truth, however painful, allows us to build more whole identities. Perhaps the most perverse aspect of silence is that it not only obscures the past, it also distorts it. In the absence of direct testimony, the collective imagination constructs simplified narratives where the Nazis are one-dimensional monsters, not complex people who made morally inexcusable decisions in specific historical contexts. This simplification has dangerous consequences. It turns Nazism into a unique historical anomaly, not what it truly was, a political movement that mobilized massive support, built everyday complicity, and transformed ordinary people into passive perpetrators or bystanders. Understanding this complexity is essential to preventing totalitarian relapses. The lesson offered by the descendants who have spoken is clear. Facing the past, however painful, allows us to build a more authentic present. This isn't about self-punishment or moral exhibitionism. It's about personal freedom and collective responsibility. Every family that breaks the silence contributes to completing the mosaic of historical memory. Every private archive opened illuminates dark areas of the past. Every honest testimony helps us understand how Nazism was possible and therefore how to prevent its return in new forms. At a time when anti-Semitism is resurfacing in Europe, when xenophobic rhetoric is gaining political traction, and when historical crimes are being trivialized, every silence weighs heavily and every absent voice becomes unwittingly complicit in oblivion. The history of Nazism did not end in 1945. It lives on in closed archives, in unexplained fortunes, in changed surnames, in distorted family histories. Silence has not only been an understandable personal response, it has been the perfect alibi for an impunity that transcends the judicial system and reaches into history, the impunity of selective memory. Speaking hurts, but not speaking hurts. This dilemma still rages within the German conscience 8 decades after the collapse of the Third Reich. And in this tension between words and silence lies, perhaps, the possibility of a future where history will not repeat itself, neither as tragedy nor as farce.